Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Harry Brailsford here, coming to you from partly sunny downtown Seattle, where cloud computing means something more than just servers in the sky. So thank you for joining us today. It's an interesting week. We're all just coming off of a holiday in the U.S., so it feels a little compressed. So I truly appreciate your time in joining us today. A little bit of housekeeping. Right now, as I speak, we have 80 attendees in the Microsoft downtown San Francisco office with Grant. Grant speaking on Office 365, Windows 10, and he's introduced actually a speech on Azure. So that's our road show. This is the last city for the first half of the year. So as of today, we've completed 9 cities. We averaged 100 attendees per city. We had 109 in LA back on Tuesday, a couple days ago. And we're going to go back to the drawing board. So your feedback's pretty important. I'm going to send you a thank you email for this webinar tomorrow. Love to get your feedback on what you would like to see for the next 9 cities. So those are going to kick off in roughly mid-July. Some familiar sponsors, some new sponsors, but it'll be Jenny and Grant on the road again. We're hearing that we want to steer the conversation more to Azure, and quite frankly, we're going to retire the Windows 10 conversation. So that's been a real win for us. That's kind of the current housekeeping. And then there's white papers up on the site that I'll talk about at Midpoint that I'd love to have you download. Next week, we have a great webinar. You're going to get the announcement tomorrow morning. A great webinar on Workspace as a Service next week from a startup coming out of Australia. It is an academic webinar, but a tip of the hat to the product that they have. With that said, oh my goodness, we're 5 minutes after, so it's midday in the West Coast, mid-afternoon on the East Coast, early evening in Europe, and we do have Eugene over in Singapore. Thanks for getting up so early, Eugene. I know it's very, very early over in Asia. Thank you very much. With that said, Stephen Dimmick, can you hear me, sir? We got to get going. How you doing? Where are you?
Harry,
okay, where are you?
I'm in Maryland. I live just north of the Washington D.C. area, and that's where I normally work, is on the east coast of the U.S.
Well, perfect. Let's just jump right into it, my friend.
Okay, well, so thank you. First of all, thank you very much, Harry. This is a great opportunity. I wanted to talk to the Microsoft partner community and the SMB partner community about Small Business Server. And I'm going to be honest, this is a conversation that came out of a conversation that I was having with a small business partner in, I think it was Hartford, Connecticut. And she was telling me that she was actively retiring all of her Small Business Server customers and moving them over to a new solution. And the reason she was actively doing it is because Small Business Server is, well, let's just say it's getting a little long in the tooth. I mean, the last generation was in the 2011 era, and frankly, it's starting to show its age. And what I really liked about my conversation is she said, we've got a formula. And it caused me to think, what made Small Business Server so exciting, and what was so interesting about her solution was this concept of a formula. And they actually both are related to each other. In other words, Small Business Server was a very prescribed way of doing Windows Server and Exchange and SharePoint. And what she was doing is she was replacing Small Business Server with her version of the next generation of Small Business Server. No, it wasn't one nice, neat package. No, it wasn't, didn't have a bunch of wizards, but it was what everything that Small Business Server really, really brought to the table. It was her version of that. So I want to be very clear on today's presentation. No, we're not announcing a new version of Small Business Server. I hate that we've done bait and switch on all of you, but the bottom line is, we may not be announcing a new version of Small Business Server, but I really want you to start thinking about what made Small Business Server great for you, and what would you do if you could create your own Small Business Server today? What would you bring together as being your best practices? And that's what you want as your Small Business Server next version. Now, why is this particular point in time so relevant? Well, it turns out as I was looking at the lifecycle policies of Microsoft products. Microsoft typically has a 5-year life cycle for mainstream support on any product we release, and then another 5 years of extended support for any product. So I went and looked up for Small Business Server, and I said, well, Small Business Server, what's the rule for it? And it turns out the support life cycle for Small Business Server is based on the discrete components that build Small Business Server. So, okay, well, that's Windows Server, and that's Exchange Server, and that's SharePoint. At least that's the starting point. And so I looked up the life cycles for each one of those products that made up SBS 2008 and SBS 2011, and this is what I came up with. The Windows Server component, mainstream support, we're out of it for both the Windows Server component for the SBS 2008 and the SBS 2011. When it comes to Exchange, well, it turns out we're out of mainstream support for both of those as well. And SharePoint, we're out of mainstream support for all three components for both the SBS 2008 and the SBS 2011 products. The two that are most popular, if they're still in market, those are the two that are most popular out there. And it caused me to think, well, if things are now at least 5 years old, if all the pieces are now at least 5 years old, and we're getting pretty close. I mean, some of these extended support dates are only 1 year, 1 to 3 years away, 4 years away. We should really be thinking, how can we make sure our customers successfully transition to the next generation of their solution? And if we're not able to move them to something that's called Small Business Server, what are we going to do? And like I said, the thought that came to mind was, let's make sure that what we move them to is a functional equivalent of Small Business Server, but make it of components that we have available to us today. Well, okay, so what were those components? What really made Small Business Server great? Well, okay, so ultimately, when I looked at Small Business Server, what made it great for me, and what I think made it great for a lot of you and your customers, is that it was fundamentally based on enterprise quality technologies. And underneath that, those enterprise quality technologies included Active Directory and Windows Server with file and print, and there was some SharePoint in there and some SQL in there, remote desktop services, and there were lots of great pieces, but they were all enterprise quality. However, those enterprise quality technologies were brought in at an SMB price, at a price that our SMBs could really embrace and support when they had 5 or 15 or 25 in the organization. And then, of course, what really tied it all together is the extra work that brought the wizards in, that made the installation simple and made the maintenance simple, and there were some nice dashboards and some control panels. But you know, I was talking with an old SBS support person, and they said that the most common reason they would get a support call on SBS was somebody didn't use the wizard. They worked around the wizard. So I know that although you love the wizards, at the same time you still liked being able to do it on your own, you know, control the pieces on your own. So the wizards are a solid piece, but not necessarily essential. What was essential was enterprise quality technologies at an SMB price and a whole solution that we could quickly and easily roll out to our customers. So with that being said, go ahead. What was that, Harry?
Well, I was going to say, if you don't mind, that I'm just this morning trading some support incidents with Microsoft CRM Online and requesting what my version of SQL is, my version of CRM. There's an upgrade schedule. I mean, I had to file a ticket to find out my version,
right?
And I miss, you know, and I wish I had the wizards. I wish I even had the command line back, because now, dude, I've got email to go do, you know, basically a VER over in DOS. I got to file
yeah.
I got to file a support incident. So I'm just saying, it's interesting how it's changed, and I miss SBS. You know, it's just hard to get granular with Office 365 and find out exactly what do I have. And
Yes,
sorry to
you are
interrupt that.
right. But at the same time, we've got to, we've got to work with the pieces that the cards that we've been dealt, and more importantly, the world has changed. I mean, there are other aspects that have changed as well. That the cloud has become more prevalent, and the concept of a command line is far less prevalent than it used to be. Although PowerShell has in a sense started to take the place of the traditional command line. So, some things have changed for the good, some things maybe not so good, but what we really want to do is want to make sure that what we continue to deliver to our customers is an enterprise quality solution. And so what I decided to do, based on the partner conversation that I had in Hartford, is I wanted to look just plain and simple, let's look at what's in the market today from Microsoft and what would be the best practice. If I could choose the best component for file and print and for messaging and for document collaboration and databases and so forth, if I could choose the best component, regardless of anything else, which pieces would I choose, and could I make those pieces work together? And so that's what that's what I want to do in this conversation, is I want to encourage all of you to think about your best solution. And I don't care if you go to the cloud, I don't care if you stay on premises, I want you to think of what are the best pieces for your best solution and create that SBS next generation for yourself. What would you be pushing if you could do the best piece in each case? And that should become your baseline configuration for your customers, which you could then, of course, modify and tailor to a particular customer's needs. But come up with a standard set that you just know works together and that you've made the pieces work together for you. That's going to be ultimately what you can deploy the fastest and the most profitably, but at the same time, know that you've got the choice and the flexibility, if necessary, behind the scenes. So let's start with identity. And from an identity point of view, we know that identity is this common place where we've got cloud identity components, and we've got Active Directory on premises, and there are other directory services, and we've of course got a myriad of PCs and devices who don't necessarily all share the same set of directories and credentials. What do we do in that situation? Well, and again, please understand, I'm a Microsoft guy, so I look at this and I say, well, I love Active Directory. I love the on-premises Active Directory. At the same time, I really do see the power and the flexibility of something like the Azure Active Directory, the cloud identity. So what in my mind, what I see as being the ideal solution is I want a little bit of both. I want that on-premises component, that Windows Server Active Directory on premises, because that's what really gives me control and really gives me that great experience. But at the same time, I want to make sure that it works with my cloud experience. In other words, I know that I can't be just one or the other. I feel I need to have a foot in both territories. And so I love the fact that Windows Server and Active Directory in Windows Server can be synchronized with the Azure world, because on the back end, behind the scenes, I know that I can leverage that Azure Active Directory with my Office 365 and my CRM Online, and I know that I can leverage that Azure Active Directory with my mobile devices, my various endpoints. So if I had my druthers, I would absolutely look at a hybrid identity solution. And so when we start talking about a hybrid identity solution, there are really three different approaches that we can take to doing a hybrid identity. We can either have the cloud and the on-premises completely independent of each other. In other words, I don't have to have a synchronization between my cloud and between my on-premises AD. As a matter of fact, here at home, I replaced my small business server ultimately with a Windows Server Essentials box, and my wife and I also use Office 365 in the cloud, and we don't do directory synchronization because, frankly, I don't plan on changing my wife. The membership of my community, we're not having any children, so the membership of my community is not changing. No names are changing. The membership's just
My goodness.
static.
I, sir, I've never heard anyone renew their marriage vows that way. That I gotta tweet that. You know,
That's
late at night, me and the Donald, me and the Donald have very different lifestyles, but I'm gonna get on Hootsuite, brother.
Yeah, well, there we go. Yeah, and my wife isn't listening. She's in Europe right now, so she's not
All
listening.
right.
But
Okay,
my
go
my
ahead.
point is, you don't have to synchronize them. You don't have to synchronize them if you don't want. But if you do choose to synchronize them, it certainly is a fairly straightforward process to do the Azure Active Directory connector and make the two connections happen from your on-premises server into your cloud, and that's a good solid solution. Now, you could go further than that. You could certainly bring in the federated concept where we stop authenticating users in the cloud and we push all the authentications back to the on-premises server. But honestly, that means so much more hardware on premises and so much more complexity in setting it up. I don't think it's appropriate to push for the federated identity. My personal opinion is the synchronized identity is by far the best solution. And remember, this is my opinion, but this is what I would be deploying. Is I would make sure there's an on-premises server. I'd make sure that there's a little Azure AD going on, and I would make sure that there is synchronization between the two, because that's going to give me and ultimately my customer the greatest flexibility for authentication and getting online and things like that. And so since I know I'm going to have an on-premises Active Directory, obviously that's going to be based on Windows Server 2012 R2. I mean, that's the current product that's in market. Yes, I know 2016 is coming out later on this year, and I'm certainly going to reevaluate it at that point, but 2012 R2 is the best choice right now, and based on everything that I see and read, 2012 R2 is going to be the best way to get me to 2016 when I'm ready to make that transition as well. So in my v.next best effort world, I'm going to go with Windows Server 2012 R2 because it puts me in a good place today, puts me in a good place for tomorrow, and it's going to give me the local files, it's going to give me the local print server, it's going to give me the things that I like because, frankly, it makes it responsive. It makes my network feel very close to home. Is it great for highly mobile employees? It's okay, but it's really good if I still have that office staff that's coming into the office. I still think that an on-premises server is a very valid thing to have. Now, with that on-premises server, do I want to do anything else with it? In other words, do I want to bring my Exchange server on premises? And this is one of the really interesting conversations that I've been having with partners. Does everybody on the line know that Exchange 2016 is in market? And it's been in market since last September? And I'll tell you that more than 50% of the partners that I talk to answer that question with a no. They didn't even know that it came out last September. It's been out, and it's been out for 6 months, and I didn't know about it. And it's got some great capabilities for collaboration and mobile productivity. But the reality is the world has changed. We no longer necessarily expect an on-premises Exchange server. It's not something that's required. There are some customers where it may be required for a particular business need, but honestly, for me, I think that going to the cloud for my messaging is probably the best. That for my customers, it's the best solution. It's the one that I'm going to recommend. And so, if I'm going to start recommending a cloud solution for messaging, of course, I'm Microsoft. I'm going to recommend Exchange Online, which is an essential component of our Office 365 suite. So, from that sense, I'm still keeping an on-premises Windows server, but at the same time, my messaging I think should be in the cloud. I think Exchange Online is my best bet for messaging. And so
Hey,
then the
Stephen.
question, yeah, please.
Yeah, Stephen, just as you're talking about awareness of general availability and release, sir, did you know, I'm sure you know, but I'm not sure everybody on the call knows, but Sequel 2016 had general availability yesterday.
Yesterday.
And there's some of us that are old-timey SQL Server guys, so shout
Well,
out to all the DBAs out there.
Absolutely. Shout out to the DBAs, and and we do need to talk about SQL Server because SQL Server is part of that SBS solution, if you remember. And
Oh
so
yeah.
I think that's a very relevant and valid point to bring up. And so we'll mention that in just a few moments. But
Okay,
yes,
well, we'll
came
we'll
out
get back to that. Okay, please
came
continue.
out yesterday and caught me completely by surprise as well. Well, you know, within reason, completely by surprise. I kind of knew that it was coming out here in early June, but that's all I knew. But bottom line is, if I'm going to do Exchange Online, what else in Office 365 do I want to use? I mean, am I really interested in all the Office 365 pieces? Am I interested in the SharePoint and the Skype for Business? Am I interested in the Productivity Suite being licensed through my Office 365 subscription? And we'll come to each one of those pieces when appropriate. I just, you know, what we've done is we've opened the door. I could do just Exchange Online, or I could do all of the Office 365 stack. What's the best solution that I think is the best solution for my customer? Well, I just want to mention that Office 365 is so much more than just a productivity tool and a communication and a collaboration and a messaging tool. This is the slide that I'm now using that represents the Office 365 ecosystem. I mean, we recognize those pieces. That's the core of Office 365. And then we add the stuff that makes Office 365 just really shine. There's all kinds of stuff that we've added to that Office 365 environment. Some you may be very excited about, some you may not care a lick about, but the point is, if you bring Office 365 into your solution, just like when you brought in the Azure Active Directory, you've given yourself other places to go with your customer if and when it's necessary. So yes, I'm going to bring in my Exchange Online. I'm going to bring in my Office 365, my toe in the Office 365 space, because I honestly want to be able to take my customer elsewhere. For example, SharePoint. Do I want to do my SharePoint on premises or online? Well, I think for SharePoint, I like it being online. I like the characteristic that I'm able to use the OneDrive, that I get my backup for all of my documents from my desktop. Some of you are going to tell me you've chosen to go with another desktop file synchronization tool because you were just tired of waiting for OneDrive to get it together. We've made great strides on OneDrive since December. I don't personally think that we are where we need to be yet, but we have certainly made great progress, and I can only sympathize with all the pain that you've gone through with your customers and you know the synchronization process. But again, if I had to do it all over, I would still use OneDrive because it does give me that integrated experience, integrated with SharePoint, integrated with the desktop, one source for everything. What were you thinking on that, Harry?
Yeah, well, a couple of thoughts. Oh boy, let me grab the talking stick and get on my high horse, my soapbox. So a couple of thoughts on OneDrive. One is 2 years ago we had a speaker at the fall conference, and I just used his line yesterday in a conversation, and he said that okay, there's the personal OneDrive and the OneDrive for business, and in nature, you have a cat and a dog, okay, cat and dog, and we're going to say OneDrive for business is a dog. You don't call a dog I mean canine, not dog in the negative sense, but
Go ahead. I just
canine. But you don't call a dog a cat plus, right? So there was some branding issues right out of the gate when they separated them, because people thought it was a cat plus, and no, it's a different species. It's a dog, okay?
Understood. I think that's and you know, we did the same thing with Skype and Skype for Business.
Yeah.
We have this marketing machine that loves to use a successful brand in perhaps sometimes too many places, but
That's
bottom
right.
line is, if you can see beyond the branding confusion,
Yeah,
then
that's what we're talking about. That's right.
yeah,
And
yeah, and I certainly appreciate,
yeah,
but
and
I
then
love
the
the
other
analogy.
Yeah, no, you're welcome to use. That's Tom Moan over in state and local government. So Shout out to Tom Moan. But any event, the other thing would be uh, is I work in industry. Part of my time, Stephen, is in industry, and part of my time is SMB Nation, and it's been wonderful to kind of do both. And as I work in industry, I like OneDrive. I mean, I'm telling you, I'm an investor and an employee in a small startup in the big data area, in addition to owning SMB Nation, and um, OneDrive meets our needs. However, I was asked and instructed to use Citrix ShareFile, and I'm not real happy about it because ShareFile, for example, from Citrix behaves like what I would call Iron Mountain, the data storage company, the trucks that pull up and get your banker's boxes and put them in a salt mine. That's archiving. Okay, so you have your banker's boxes lined up, and Iron Mountain comes and gets them and locks them up. ShareFile behaves that way. I cannot easily save to ShareFile from Citrix. I cannot double-click and open from ShareFile and Citrix. It wants to download a fresh copy that I have to rev. It puts it in my download folder, the yellow folder on C drive. I rev it, I re-upload it. It feels like the Iron Mountain guy coming to get my banker's box, right?
Sure.
OneDrive is a seamless double-click. It's sort of like a C drive in the sky, brother. I mean, I like
that's,
it.
That's what it should be, but
Yeah.
I'm just acknowledging that for the partners on the call, that 6 months ago, that was not the experience they were feeling. We heard a lot of partners lamenting their experience, and a year ago, it wasn't a C drive in the cloud, and there was a lot of pain there. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the pain was there. The product has improved. Is it what I want to see as a final product? No, but it is absolutely much better. It's what I mean, I live with it being a Microsoft employee. I use it all the time. So it's part of my regular routine that my desktop and every document on my desktop is also in the cloud. And the fact that those documents are in the OneDrive for Business Cloud, that makes me more incented to use the SharePoint Online because it's in the cloud as well. That was my tie back to all of that. But I hear you. And I think the most important thing is what you brought up, Harry, is you looked at these products and you said, well, what works best for me? What's my best solution? And that's what I think every partner on this call needs to be doing, is thinking, what would be the best pieces? Let me create that best SBS experience using the pieces that I see available to me. And we're not all going to agree, but at the same time,
no, hardly.
that's the point. That's the point of our industry. We rarely agree.
Hey, let me take a midpoint shout out and
Please.
update if you don't mind, sir. So, folks, we're at the bottom of the hour. You're attending the SBS Next conversation. And I'll have Stephen kind of preface again what the nature of the conversation is in a moment. Some of you came in since we started. It's our weekly webinar, a couple of shout outs. So what's going on right now is we have a very robust crowd right now in San Francisco with Jenny and Grant on Azure 365 and Win 10, our workshop. It is the last workshop for the first half of the year. It's our 9th city. Going to take about a 6 to 8 week break. We'll be back with another 9 cities. We're looking at smaller, underserved cities this fall. So St. Louis, perhaps a Denver, perhaps a Salt Lake. So we're looking at some cities we don't get to enough, and our sponsors don't get to enough. So keep an eye out for that. We have white papers. I want to have a shout out to Symantec. They are sponsoring SMB Nation right now, so if you could be so kind as to go over to smbnation.com, click over on the white papers. There's 2 security white papers concerning SSL certificates and malware. So if you wouldn't mind downloading those, that helps us, it helps you. Appreciate your support and appreciate Symantec's support. And then next week we have a webinar, same time, same place, on Workspace as a service. So, Stephen, I'm going to hand it back to you. If you could maybe give the context
Absolutely.
that is the nature of this webinar, and then we'll get right back to this slide that you have on the screen, sir.
You betcha. Okay, well, so the idea of today's presentation is no, Microsoft is not announcing a new version of Small Business Server v.next. What I wanted to do, though, is I wanted to introduce the concept. What made Small Business Server great was enterprise quality technologies at an SMB price. If you could do the same thing yourself, what pieces would you choose to make your perfect server to offer to your customers? And since Small Business Server is starting to get to the point where we're going to need to start retiring some of those Small Business Server 2008 and 2011 boxes that we've deployed, what would we replace those boxes with? And at this point, Harry, what we've really come up with is we've come up with that we're going to have a Windows Server on premises, and it's going to do some file and print for us. It's also going to be our source of directory services for identity. We're going to have some Azure AD in the cloud so that we can have cloud identity as well as on-premises identity, and I'm going to recommend that we do the directory synchronization between the two. We're also going to leverage at least the Exchange Online component for our messaging. Rather than bringing Exchange back on premises, let's go ahead and leave it in the cloud where it's well served. And since we're introducing cloud components anyway, keep our SharePoint, our document collaboration space in the cloud. Now, that's not to say you won't have files on premises, because you do have a file server on premises, but I'm just saying that having SharePoint in the cloud and having your OneDrive in the cloud gives you some extra flexibility. And remember, our goal here is to create an ideal solution for your typical customer. You can always do permutations of this, but so far that's what my ideal customer would receive, is they're going to have an on-premises Windows server synchronizing to Azure AD using Office 365 for their messaging and their document collaboration. And you know, one of the things, this is actually very similar to what I do use here at home. I do use Office 365 for my email. My wife and I do use SharePoint in the cloud, but we still have a file server here at home. And people go, well, Steve, why do you have a file server? I mean, aside from the fact that you're a nerd. And I point out that when my wife and I take a trip, we will take 2,000 to 3,000 pictures. And of those 2,000 to 3,000 pictures, there are maybe 5 that are any good. Do I need to post 2,000 pictures online for the 5 good ones? Absolutely not. So I keep the 2,000 pictures on my file server here at home, and the 5 good ones, well, those go up on the SharePoint so that family and friends can see them. So that's my example. But the reality is, if you look at your customers, I think you'll find there's a lot of local data they still want. Having that local file server could still be valuable to you, but at the same time, there are going to be those certain types of documents that you want in the cloud. And so at this point, we've really kind of covered the core, most of the core of the original Small Business Server. There were a few other pieces, though, that we want to at least acknowledge in the original Small Business Server. One of those pieces was the Azure piece. And the real question is, should Azure be the Azure piece, the SQL piece. And the question is, should SQL be on premises or should SQL be in the cloud? And I know, Harry, I know you did the shout out for the SQL 2016 just got launched yesterday. Very exciting, and we fully expect a lot of people to implement SQL Server on premises, and there's no reason not to, because again, it's a data source, and you want your data source often close to your applications. I'm not questioning any of that. But if you look at it from a purely complexity and technology point of view, wow, being able to leverage something like Azure SQL database and just let Microsoft take care of the pieces. If SQL is what you need for a solution, can you get away with a cloud version? There are actually 2 different ways that we do SQL in the cloud. We can either do a discrete SQL server in a virtual machine, but I'll be honest, that's just as complex as doing SQL Server on premises. The only difference is I don't have to pay for the hardware up front when I'm doing it with a SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine. So my personal opinion is that if my customer needed SQL and I could get away with this. And I realize with SQL there's a lot of compatibility questions, but if I can get away with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my SQL into Azure Sequel, let Microsoft do the maintenance, let Microsoft take care of making sure that the bandwidth and the performance is up to what I need. All I do is I put in the request. This is what my throughput needs to be. This is where my locations need to be. Microsoft take care of the rest, and now I start using it for data. Again, that makes a huge assumption that the application is compatible with that, and I know that that's not always the case.
Well, and what I would tell you is with some work I'm doing on the outside, if you will, that we have a big database instance up on AWS, and dude, I mean, we don't have any servers here,
Sure.
Not a one. I mean, everything's in the cloud, and so when you talk about an Oracle or you talk about some of the CMS packages like Drupal or the Elastic database, or it's a whole host of them, but yeah, I don't need SQL inside the four walls, but I do need, for lack of a better term, direct access to SQL, right? I mean, I need the developers to be able to do stored procedures and whatever developers do.
whatever those, isn't that amazing?
Whatever those guys are doing over in Russia and Spain, I don't know, man.
but that's the point, Harry. Again, you've hit it right on the head. You have made a choice based on the necessities of your environment, and if those necessities, in your case, you're saying, okay, I don't want to deal with the capex of having the hardware on premises and all the support costs of having the hardware on premises. I'll let it be hosted somewhere else, but I still want the flexibility of the full SQL Server stack. You've got that as a choice, and I love the fact that you've got that as a choice, and that's the route that you're taking. I'm simply saying if I can get away with it, I am really lazy, and if I can let somebody else take care of the rest of even the configuration and regular maintenance, I'll let them do that as well, because that's I did so little SQL Server when I was a consultant that's my comfort point.
No, hey, and just folks, a little housekeeping. I've got a heck of a lot of questions being asked. That's fine. We'll get to those. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of them, but Larry Doyle over in Dublin was asking if the deck is available. I can say the recording's available. Stephen,
I will make the deck absolutely. I will absolutely make the deck available. Harry, I can make it available through you if you would like, or I can make it available.
Yeah, go ahead and do that. Yeah, go ahead and do that, and I'll send it out tomorrow. Make it a PDF, and I'll send it out so it's a little bit smaller. But folks, we're going to get to your questions. If we run out of time, part of Stephen's job is to take care of the partner.
Support.
So yeah, so I will forward. Stephen, you'll get all the questions, and you can answer them one-off.
Excellent.
Okay, let's jump on. We got about 19 minutes left. Let's rock.
We're doing good. We're doing good here. So SQL was one of those advanced features that was part of SBS, and we wanted to at least acknowledge that it's there, whether you do it on premises, whether you do it in the cloud, or whether you do it in the cloud and let Microsoft handle all the pieces. Completely up to you. My personal preference, let Microsoft handle all the pieces. I'm going to put it in SQL Azure. Harry's going to put it in a VM in Amazon Web Services. We've got that SQL running for us. The next thing is we want to talk about the remote desktop application, the remote desktop services or application services. And I want to just acknowledge that when we did this on premises, there were a lot of pieces involved to make it successful. You had to have a session host and a connection broker and a gateway, and you had to configure all those pieces. And then you could either connect to it from a desktop point of view or from an application point of view, and it really lets you get in using any device you wanted. You could get to a Windows-like desktop or application experience. That's what we want to replicate that. We want to make sure that we're able to do that with our solution. And so the question is, we've got a Windows server, we're obviously using Office 365 and Azure, do we still need desktop services? And I'm going to say, depending on the line of businesses your customer is working with, Probably they do. So how do you make that happen in the cloud? Well, you could either leave it on premises, and I'm not fond of that. I prefer moving my line of business stuff into the cloud, in which case I can build up the exact same remote desktop services stack in Azure. We've even got a white paper that takes you through all the steps. I could build up that Azure virtual machine stack and literally recreate RDS in the cloud. But even that is more effort than I think I really want to be taking. The purpose is to let me run that line of business application on any device, and I can get away with that if I'm leveraging the technology that Microsoft calls Azure Remote App. And what Azure Remote App, again, what it's doing is it's going to take all of that complexity of setting up the session host and the connection broker and the gateway, and Microsoft is going to take care of the scale. Microsoft is going to take care of the connections. You still need to provide us what a session host looks like, but we will even take care of making sure that session host gets scaled to the size that you need for your user community. The net result is a very simple experience from a management and support point of view. Oops, we also lose the desktop. Now, I actually am not fond of remote desktop. I love remote app, but I'm not fond of remote desktop because I've always felt that remote desktop was confusing. I've got my desktop, and then I've got this second desktop, and some applications are going to run on my desktop, and some applications are going to run on the second desktop, and I can copy and move things between the two, and I can print, but wow, it's just a little confusing. I loved it when Citrix first came out with the remote app concept, and of course Microsoft, because we're based on Citrix, we brought it into our technology eventually. I love that experience, that it's just this virtual app. It's coming from a server somewhere else, but just appears like the Word and the Excel that are sitting right next to it. It's just a window that might look a little different, but it functions the same way as the rest of my desktop. So actually, I don't mind Azure Remote App is my unique solution because it's something that I can do the host, let Microsoft take care of the scale, let Microsoft take care of the details, and I get the best experience for my end users. So this becomes my personal favorite way to do remote desktop services, is actually just do remote app. And if you've got more than one application, you can have multiple applications in your session host. You don't get charged anymore for that. So that's my personal solution. And that ultimately then brings me to the final piece as far as the structured puzzle, and that was that wonderful thing called the remote web workplace, the thing that made SBS unique compared to everybody else. Nobody else at Microsoft had that except the SBS people. Well, as SBS was phased out, the Windows Server Essentials came into being, and it got its own, its own variant of the remote web workplace. And then ultimately, what's happened is the Essentials, the server, which still exists obviously, but the pieces that made that Essentials server and that remote web place unique, those are now part of every copy of Windows Server, whether it's standard or data center. It's no longer unique, but frankly, it still has, as a matter of fact, it has a better set than it's ever had. It still has the ability to help you connect quickly. It still has, well, it's now got the whole backup experience as part of this. It's got some really nice capabilities. So if you're tied to or you're really bound to that Essentials experience, we can bring it up with Standard Edition or Data Center Edition. We can bring it up on premises. We could bring it up if we need it in the cloud. There are alternatives if necessary. So I think we've got a solution there. So in my mind, and this again is my personal choice, if I was going to create the next generation of small business server for my customers, I would need these pieces. And from these pieces, I'm going to make the following choices. I'm going to put Windows Server on premises for my Active Directory, but I'm also going to tie it to my Azure Active Directory. I'm going to leverage my on-premises Windows Server for file and print, and if I need a web server, I've got that there as well. My Exchange is going to come out of Office 365, as is my SharePoint, just because that's the best place for those to be, in my opinion, today. SQL Server, I'm going to run that out of Azure, and I'm going to leverage the Azure Sequel. We know that Harry's going to go with the AWS and the SQL Server hosted in AWS. But that's the great thing about this. It's just he's got a different baseline. That's a great starting point. For my RDS, I'm going to use Azure Remote App, and for my workplace, I'm going to use the Essentials experience out of Windows Server 2012 R2. And so this is what I see as being my ideal stack. And I mean, we could go further and we could talk about where these technologies then take you, because we've only used parts of these pieces. We could then, there's so much more we could do with Office 365 and so much more we could do with Azure, but frankly, that's not what I wanted this conversation to be. I wanted this conversation to be about you thinking about what you liked in Small Business Server, what you would do instead, because Small Business Server doesn't exist today. So what would you do instead? And creating a baseline configuration for yourselves that you can make sure every one of your engineers knows how to do this like the back of their hand. They can just do all those pieces in the right order, make all the connections. You might even script some of it out or document pieces of it, but you've got that baseline configuration that you can then use as your starting point. Your salespeople have one thing to pitch, and it's always more successful when they can start with one really solid pitch. And if you need to change it, sure, we can modify it for you. You're a valued customer. Of course we'll modify it for you. But the reality is you're able to start with a very common baseline. And that's one of the hidden values of that Small Business Server 2008 and 2011, is that it was just that great combination that worked the way I wanted it to work out of the box. Let's make that happen again, and this is the time to do it. So, Harry, what are some of the questions that we've got out there?
Yeah,
let's
well,
focus on that.
let me two additional thoughts, and we do have questions. I got to expand my screen, the little control panel here. Let's see how I'm gonna do that. Let's first of all break it out of the control panel and drag and drop wide. Okay, a lot from some old friends, Scott Buchanan and Ken Schaefer, will get you to you guys. But what I would offer, Stephen, is a little feedback. Maybe in future presentations or conversations, I would offer a slide or two about the front office, Microsoft Office itself, because I always saw that part and partial to Small Business Server. That really it was sort of a back office and front office experience, and you and I even remember the SKU called back office.
Yes, I do too. I do too. I remember where I was sitting when I got my first back office and got to open it up.
Yeah, and I think there's a whole nother round of conversation there, because then what that does in my eyes, I mean, yes, Word, Excel, and PowerPoint and all that, but what it does in my eyes is then leads into a conversation about Power BI, which is kind of like Excel charting on steroids. So there's kind of a gateway to another conversation coming out
of
the front office into Power BI, and folks, that's where I'm investing some time, is analytics, and analytics leads to visualization. And that's a whole nother conversation. So that's not why we're here.
Your point is well taken. And again, could we base it on what we've got here? Sure, some SharePoint out of the Office 365 stimulates the Power BI piece, and the Office 365, if we acquire it the right way, includes the productivity suite. So you're right on track. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to take it from the top. So Ken. Eugene is pitching in from Singapore. We have Larry in Dublin. We got everybody. Okay, we answered the question about the slides. Then we have Bill Walter asking, for a widely distributed small business, i.e. no central office, can Azure AD with Office 365 be made to work with no on-prem server? In other words, have Windows 10 desktops and tablets join Azure AD rather than the local server AD? That's Bill Walter. What do you think?
So the answer, this is actually a multi-part answer, so I apologize to be complex, but to be specific to what was just enumerated, Windows 10 can, as a machine, be authenticated against Azure AD. In other words, we made it so that Windows 10 can do an authentication against Azure AD. That's unique to Windows 10. It doesn't happen in Windows 8. It doesn't happen in Windows 7. It's unique to Windows 10. If you have an environment that has Windows 7 and Windows 8 machines, and you still want to have machine authentication, you can't get away with just Azure AD, because just Azure AD officially only does user authentication. So if you want to have both machines and users authenticated by your directory service, what you're going to need to do is spin up a Windows server in the Azure cloud so that you have the full AD experience in the Azure cloud, and then you can do the full authentication. One of my peers, Rob Wagner, actually has a video on setting up an entire company solution with no servers on premises, but still doing Active Directory in the Azure cloud. He's not using Azure AD, he's using Windows Server and running Active Directory in that Windows Server running in the cloud. So the answer is we can do a solution. Is it all on Azure? Only if it's only Windows 10 clients. They have to be exclusively Windows 10 clients.
Okay. Can we have SSO, single sign-on, using synchronized identity?
And so that's the answer is yes. We can make that happen, and that's part of that same conversation. But yes, we can get that single sign-on, and that's again the reason I like the Azure AD piece. I can get not only single sign-on for the Microsoft pieces, but I can now start doing single sign-on for my Salesforce.com, and I can do it for my how about Google Apps and Dropbox and Box? In other words, because I've got Azure AD in that picture, I've got the capabilities of having a single sign-on to, I think the list is now over 2,600 software as a service solutions that I can have access to with a single sign-on. So the answer is yes, absolutely, in spades.
Okay, Larry Doyle says, need a recording of this. I'm in the pub in sunny Ireland, and it's 8:20 at night. So yes, Larry, there's a recording. Ken Schaefer, frankly, the reason we haven't heard.
Thank you for painting that picture for us, Larry.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, no, and he's a good guy. You should go over and see Larry. Good guy.
Spend some time in Ireland. Okay, I'm there.
Yeah, good guy. Ken, frankly, the reason we haven't heard about Exchange 2016 on-premise being available since last fall is we're all hearing about the Office 365. I think he's alluding to the Office 365 message is too loud or overwhelming.
Yeah, Microsoft is obviously driving our cloud message really, really strongly, and I hear you on that. And we do see that as truly being the future of our company.
Right.
And that's, I mean, you have to understand, we're all about self-preservation. We want to make sure that we survive into the next generation and into the next decade. And when we look at our version of the crystal ball, we see more services moving to the cloud, not exclusively, but more services moving to the cloud. And so we want to make sure that we are in a good position with that cloud, but at the same time, we know that our legacy is on-premises solution. We haven't given up on them. They're there. We offer them, and we offer them with great new features. So what's best for you?
Yeah. Hey, speaking of which, because and Ken, thank you for your several questions. There's no way in heck we're going to get to all these, but Stephen, I know it's part of your report card to answer these, so I'm going to assume that's going to happen.
I will do my best
but
to get them all
I
answered.
do want to provide some context on the Office 365 things. I think you might like this, you guys, is that we're going to be using a variety of survey techniques, including some A/B testing and so on in the month of June, to find out what you would like our community, our trademark, Office 365 Nation to be going forward. And I'll tell you why, Stephen. We've tried we've kind of been at market. July would be 2 years with that, both URL and trademark, and we just haven't hit. We haven't seen the same, and maybe you can speak to this, but my hope and desire is we would have seen the SBS cult again. We would have seen the Macintosh cult of yesteryear in the 80s. And either we're not tapping into it, or there's just not, I kind of come away with the impression that Office 365 is a utility, and it's hard to get people excited about Puget Sound Energy. Woohoo! Let's get excited about electricity. Let's have a monthly user group meeting about electricity. I'll leave it at that. We're going to do some surveying, but Stephen, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing marches on Washington and on the for Office 365.
If Office 365 disappeared tomorrow, would we have partners just crying that you've gotten rid of my Office 365, like what happened when we announced the retirement of SBS? And I think you're right, Harry. We wouldn't see that. I think in part it's because Office 365 does feel more like a utility than the previous products. But again, that's a change in the industry. Not our fault that the industry changed. Not our fault that the cloud became popular. But again, what's the best way to do this? I also think that Office 365 isn't as mature. I mean, if you think about where SBS was when it was finally retired, it had been in market for a good solid decade. And, despite what we may think, Office 365 has really only been in market for about 3 or 4 years. I mean, there was BPAWS before it, but it hasn't been in market that long. So if you really think about its value and its presence for its age, it's doing really well. I think you were just ahead of the game. And that as more and more people start looking at Office 365 as part of their solution, I think a community around that has great value. Because go back to that slide that I had earlier where I had all of those different products that are affiliated with Office 365. Wouldn't it be great if you had one place to go where you could find experts in Planner and in Power BI, and I think that's what the new Office 365 needs to bring to the table. Is it's not just Exchange, SharePoint, Skype, and the productivity suite. It's all this other stuff, and it's things that make me excited in a particular way. Not that are part of this core, but it's particular things. And so I think that's kind of the new world.
Yeah, stay tuned, guys. We're gonna sort it out. You'll get some survey requests, and different groups will get different surveys. Blah 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 blah. So
I'm all about supporting that.
Yeah. Final question. We have Eugene Tan over in Singapore. So Ken, forgive me. Scott Buchanan, forgive me. I'm going to have those multiple questions answered offline. If you don't, they're very good friends, so hopefully they're forgiving. But Eugene got up so darn early over in Singapore. I got to take this question, and thank you, sir.
Please. Yes.
He says branding is a huge issue when it miscommunicates. It either reinforces trust or it creates mistrust. Is Azure Sequel still SQL or something else?
So that's a great question. It is from a purist point of view, from the point of view where Harry had taken the conversation, it is not exactly the same SQL that SQL Server is, but relative to other brands where we have done the hybrid where one brand being used for two different things, it is much closer. In other words, a lot of the functionality that you expect and that you rely upon with a dedicated SQL Server or a SQL Server in a Azure or AWS virtual machine, a lot of that functionality does get exposed in exactly the same way with Azure SQL. And so ultimately it requires the certification of the third-party vendor whose application uses SQL Server. They've still got to certify it, but our goal is to make it easier for them to certify and fundamentally more successful in that certification process. So I think we're closer, but I do appreciate your concern because I think it's a very valid concern.
Okay, perfect. And I'm thinking, Stephen, maybe I'll talk with you offline. We'll debrief, but there's a lot of questions. Maybe we can turn this into a follow-up webinar. There's an hour. There's an hour of
Of
questions.
questions.
Okay. And I don't think we sold the 4th of July week as a webinar. I know we're kind of stuffed on the schedule for a while, but we typically don't sell the 4th of July week for obvious reasons.
Obvious
So maybe,
reasons.
yeah, maybe we can shoehorn this in.
Sneak one in. I
Um,
am happy to support you there, Harry. But still, let's make sure the questions come back. I'm happy to do answers back to individuals,
oh yeah,
and then we can
yeah.
do a group session. You betcha.
Yeah, that's right. I think we've got enough here. There's a lot of interest, and I get it. I know that Ken and Scott will at least show, and Eugene and Larry will show up. I know, who will show up. But folks, we've run over time. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and join us next week for Workspace as a Service. WPC's coming up. That's not for everybody. Stephen, will you be at WPC? That's not always the perfect fit for the small business partner, but will you be there?
The small business team, my team, the TS2 team, always shows up. So there will be small business people there. You betcha.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, folks. You will get your questions answered, and we're going to talk about a follow-up webinar. Have a great day.